Thank you very much. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Erik Wilde, or Erik Wilde. I'm used to both ways of pronouncing it. So as Mike said, I'm the newest member of the API Academy. And I want to talk about microservices and web architecture. And the reason why I picked that topic is I'm new to the team. So I still want to take a little bit of my old experience into that. And also, I think that web architecture actually can teach us a lot about the things that maybe we can apply, we can use patterns. And it's actually kind of a nice segue from what Mike was just talking about when he was talking about evolution and innovation and how an ant colony doesn't have management, right? So when you look at the web and the tremendous success that the web had and has, right, it doesn't really have a management, right? Nobody is sitting there and planning how the web should evolve. It just evolves. It's a great platform for you to build stuff on. And it has been incredibly successful. And the reason for that success is really that it provides a great foundation for people to build good things on. And a lot of good stuff happens. A lot of stuff happens that dies, that nobody ever uses, right? And all of that somehow, so far, seems to really work out in a way that creates a lot of innovation, that creates a space that a lot of people can play in and try out interesting ideas. And I think that microservices actually are kind of going in the same direction, right? I think there's a lot of similarities. So very briefly about myself and why I'm so interested in that particular angle of looking at microservices. So I have a long history in web architecture and web technology. So originally, I'm a computer scientist. I graduated in computer communications, and then now it's almost 20 years ago, I started working in web technologies and started looking at all those things that develop on the web and how the web works and how it is possible that the web, even though it's evolving so rapidly to some extent, also remains so stable, right? So I started my career sort of in web architecture by writing, back then it was the first book on web technologies. And I published that in 1998. So that's almost 20 years ago now, right? And when I look at that book today, it's amazing how many of the things that are in that book are pretty much unchanged today, right? It's still HTTP, URIs, HTML is also kind of the same, right? It evolved over time. But the fundamental underlying principles really are very, very robust, right? And I think that's a very interesting combination of looking at sort of this very, very robust foundation and then the dynamics that can happen on top of it. And somehow the web was able to strike that balance between creating that foundation that is very, very dynamic and also being stable so that you can build things and they work for a very long time, right? And it's amazing how that contradiction almost, right, really works. And quite a while ago, when the first wave of web services came about, right, I got excited because I was looking into web technologies. That was sort of my new area of interest, but I also had a background in computer communications. So I thought, hey, that's interesting. People are actually looking at how to use not the web just for user-facing things, but really for building services as a service ecosystem, right? And then pretty soon after the whole first wave of SOA web services started, a certain fraction, I would say, of people became a little disillusioned with what happened because the things were called web services, but they really weren't webby at all, right? It was like sort of good old centralized enterprise architecture, and almost the only webby thing in them was XML, right? Somebody discovered, hey, we can use XML to represent data. Let's do that and call it web services, right? So when you looked at what happened back then, it was really still sort of the idea that you build a system, right? The way how you build something is you build a system. You have an idea of what you're building, you're managing that, you're making it happen, you control everything from the top down, and then at some point you're done, your result is good, and everything's great, right? And that viewpoint traded a lot of the advantages that the web has and a lot of the unique design features that the web gives us for things such as being able to use sort of traditional mechanisms such as RPC. People wanted to generate stubs and do all these kind of things, right? So the stubs would break when things were changing, so you weren't allowed to change things. And so it was all a very brittle and very tightly coupled architecture. And back then, when I was also active in sort of the REST community that looked at, well, let's look at how the web actually works, sort of an architectural level, kind of looked at SOAP and SOA back then as it developed and pretty quickly decided, not really what we're thinking when we're thinking about webby architectures. And then kind of things got a little disconnected, right? So SOA to some extent really was claiming to be web services, but not really doing it. And going forward a little bit, right, to me it really seems that when I look at what microservices are doing today, it is much more in line with what can be seen as being very webby, right? Where you say there's a lot of autonomy, you try to foster innovation, you design for failure, you accept that certain things might just die because they are not good or they have dependencies that are not good or these kind of things. And the whole idea of taking this very centralized approach of what SOA did and putting it into a much more agile and decentralized structure, to me, seems like a very, very good idea, right? It's mimicking what made the web so successful, now really at the level of what a web service architecture maybe should look like for an organization, right? And it's much more accurate in reflecting the important parts of what makes the web great. However, one thing that I see a little bit is that since the focus right now is so much on how do you create those microservices, right? How do you empower the teams? How do you get to the point where people can do it? You give them the tooling to do it. You have sort of the technologies that you can do this and you can deploy it and all these kind of things, which is all great. But it also seems to me that some parts of the overall picture sometimes get a little bit missing. And those are the things I want to talk about just a little bit. And before I start doing that, I would like to just very briefly introduce you to kind of what I try to paint as a picture of what the Microsoft landscape maybe today looks like, right? So the idea that I'm trying to show here is that in many cases what I'm seeing is that you have microservices as sort of the foundational layer, which does not necessarily get exposed to the outside, right? It can very well be just an internal set of services that you hide, that you do not want to expose. And then on top of that, you have what maybe more traditionally you would call APIs, or they might also be microservices. It doesn't really matter, right? But these are the things you would like to expose to the outside. So what you have is basically you have two levels of those APIs, of those services. Those here are supposed to be relatively agile, right? They can evolve. New ones will come into existence. Some might disappear. And then those ones here maybe are supposed to be a little bit more stable, hopefully, maybe. Depends on what you're trying to do. Because on the very top, right, you might have consumers, external consumers, that depend on them. And where you say, well, for those, we might want to produce more stability. We have a different way of how we deal with versioning. Whatever it is that those consumers are expecting from you or that you are promising to them, right? So that's kind of the overall picture that I see. And that I also sometimes see in scenarios that I think are very interesting. I'll get to one of those in a minute. So this is just showing this. So this is the scenario that I would just like to mention as I think, and I haven't seen that much activity in that space, but I think it's really exciting to look at what's the overlap between the Internet of Things and microservices, right? Because I've been that's one of the application areas of web architecture and web technologies I've been active in a while, is Internet of Things and what we call the Web of Things, basically applying web architecture to IoT scenarios. And one of the fundamental patterns that you see a lot in anybody playing in that space is you have this structure, pretty much, right? So you have all kinds of things that are developing, that evolve, that come into existence, may go away, right? So this may be your building automation, right? Different sensors you have, actuators you have in your building, and that usually is a pretty diverse and heterogeneous environment, and very often also you don't control all of that, right? So I've worked for Siemens for a little while, and when we looked at building technologies, right, very often you want to have some automation in your building. You want to build a home automation system or an office building automation system, but you don't really own all the components in it, right? So maybe the air conditioner is a different company and the thermostats are a different company. So you kind of have the same picture that you see here, right? You have this 2 layers of a relatively diverse ecosystem of things that appear, and you have very little control over them because they might just be components that are brought into your overall architecture. And then you want to expose those in a way that actually is relatively robust, makes sense, has maybe a nicer cohesion from a user point of view so that people can build their consoles or whatever they want to build on top of that, right? So that's definitely, I think, one of the things where you can see that there's quite an overlap between scenarios that are very webby today and then what we look at when we see microservices. And I think the areas that might be interesting to look at and that I see right now as a little bit of blind spots where there's not as much focus on them as there could be that might be interesting would be to say, how do I actually manage that evolution of my microservice landscape, right? And that very much depends on how many I have. If I have just 10, 20, maybe I really don't need to worry that much, right? Maybe I know everybody who's developing them, so that's really not such a big issue. But we've heard already this morning, right, and you read more and more about scenarios and companies where you have easily hundreds of microservices. And when you look at this and you think about all the devices that you might want to aggregate, maybe using a microservices style, it's probably easily thousands of them, right? Different ones that you want to keep an eye on and see which ones do I support? How do they work? What are the interfaces that they have, right? So this idea of how do I actually figure out how my landscape is developing, right? I think that's something where the web has taught us a lot. And the microservices space right now really doesn't focus that much on that space. And I think that would be something interesting to look at, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the other thing that I would like to talk to a little bit is basically designing for evolution. And what I mean by that is not so much for evolution in the sense where microservices right now really look at it very well in terms of how easy is it to create a new microservice, right? So that's hopefully very easy. That's the whole point of microservices. But more in terms of also what we heard already, like what are the guidelines, guardrails, whatever you might call it, right? I guess I cannot say rules because that always seems to be a bad word. But is there some mechanism in place where if a team develops a microservice, the likelihood that if they want to improve it, extend it, that this breaks somebody consuming that microservice, that this likelihood is reduced, right? So what are the lessons that we've learned about services being designed in a way that they can evolve instead of me having to version them in a hard way, right? And there's always a limit to that, of course. But there's a very big body of experience in doing that, right? And again, that's what the web architecture community has been doing for a long time, because the web is the example that we have where things are very autonomous, right? Usually, when you consume a service on the web, I shouldn't say web service, right? If you consume a service on the web, the provider is different from the consumer, right? It's different authorities. So the likelihood of that being a successful scenario improves if those things are loosely coupled, right? Meaning that if something changes a little bit over here, this here shouldn't break, right? And there are limits to that. But providing a little bit more guidance or just best practices, saying we know these are the things that work, we know these are the things that don't work so well, I think that's something that I also haven't seen so much in the microservices space so far. And I think that's really something where we can learn a lot from web architecture and the things that have been tried out for the past 10 years. So very briefly, I would like to talk about those two things, right? So one thing, how do I find microservices? How does my landscape look like? How does it change? How can I figure out what I have in my landscape? And then the second question is, how do I manage evolution of individual services? What's the extensibility model that I have? And funny enough, we didn't really coordinate that, but earlier on, Holger had a very similar picture, right? So this is my starting picture. This is what you have, what you don't like. It's a picture of one of those very, very complicated machines. In that case, it doesn't do anything. But nobody knows, right? Because typically, right, for sort of the caricature of the monolith is nobody has any idea what it's doing anyway. The only thing that you need, that you know, is I need it, right? Like parts of it I need, right? This part maybe, and maybe this. Anyway, so that's kind of the starting point, right? And then what microservices promise you, and that's very similar to the picture that Holger had, is this, right? A very neat toolbox. I think he had little spools of yarn, right? But like something very organized where you can say, well, these things are all very homogeneous. It's easy to understand what they do. If this thing doesn't work anymore, I'll just switch it. If I need a new one, I just get a new one. It kind of fits into that. So everything looks neat and clean and wonderful. What I think, at least judging from the web as a bigger playground, right, what might happen over time if you look at what happens if you tell people, go and build tools, right? Does that happen? Maybe. You might also end up with this, right? A lot of tools, each of those built by somebody who solved one particular problem, very specific, and based on very different design preferences and ideas, right? So that is kind of maybe not what you're shooting for, but depending on how many services you have, how long your landscape is evolving over time, how diverse your developer population is, what their preferences are, how much guidelines you give them, right? You might end up with something that looks a little, let's say, more like this than this, right? And then the next question is, well, now what, right? How do I find the tool for the job, right? I know I want to get something done. I know somewhere there must be a tool, right? So how do I find it? And I think that is where the web already gives us a very good idea. So when you look at what traditional web services did, the SOAP stack, right? They had this thing that probably today is more like a joke, the UDDI. Who here knows what UDDI is? Wow, it's that dead. Okay. Yeah. The rest of you don't bother. It's not even worth a Google. So UDDI was basically a directory of services, but it was bad in every conceivable way, and it never really had any success. But the idea was basically that you would force a certain way of describing a service onto developers of web services, and then you would collect all of those into this directory, and then you would allow people to search the directory, right? And like I said, there's a lot to why it didn't work. But what's clear when you look at microservices today is definitely that this idea that you prescribe one way of how you have to describe your service, that's probably not going to work, right? Because what would you tell people to use, right? Would you say you have to use Swagger or you have to use this or that? There's a lot of different formats, and the different documentation formats for services also depend a lot on what kind of service you're publishing, right? What have you picked as your implementation platform? right? So it's probably something where you would say, instead of doing sort of the command and control kind of thing, where from the top down you say, everybody has to describe it like this, I'm collecting it, and then I'm publishing it, right? So that is actually, if you look at it, right, this is sort of the old Yahoo style of web discovery, right? We categorize everything according to one scheme, and then we collect it, and then we display it to everybody. And what's probably more likely to be successful in that space, and like I said, there's not much that's happening right now. I just think that's an interesting thing to think about and maybe to start thinking how that might matter for you in the long run, is doing it more sort of in a googly way, right? It's like try to encourage, incentivize documentation, and then try to make the most out of what you're getting, right? And maybe people are not doing a whole lot. Then maybe you have to think about why that is and come up with some ways of how you encourage them to do a little bit more. But this whole idea of loosely coupling this documentation, which then would be decentralized, and there is somebody who just goes around and collects it from time to time, right? I think that is something that, to me, fits this whole idea of a more autonomous ecosystem much better, right? So what you would end up with is kind of decentralized discovery, right? You would not have the central authority. You would basically have almost like a search engine. And depending on how much guidelines you would produce and say you have to document at least this, right? At least you have to give us your phone number so that we know who to call when your service breaks, right? This is the very, very least thing you have to do. But depending on what you put in place, you could make this more or less complete or interesting. But I think it's definitely a pattern that might be much more likely to succeed than this old school web services way where you say everybody has to do it the same way or it's not going to work. Okay, so that's all I want to mention in that space. And now for the second topic that I wanted to talk about just a little bit, which is the idea of evolution. Right? So how do things evolve over time? How we can minimize breakage when people tweak things a little bit. And the idea there really is also that, well, microservices tell us teams should be able to deploy new services all the time, right? Updates. Say, well, this service is different now, right? But probably every time you do that, it would be nice if not every time you did that, you would break everything. Right? Of course, if it breaks, then hopefully you have design for failure and somehow you deal with it. But even better, it doesn't break. Right? And the likelihood of you preventing breaks is a direct result of you designing for change. Right? That is the big thing, basically, that I want to make here is that coming up with an idea of how you design your service so that you can change it to a certain degree with limitations, right, without breaking things, I think that is also something that I would like to see more emphasized in the microservices space. And that's basically the other side of how change can happen, right? One change that can happen that we just looked at is my landscape changes, right? New services come into being, how do I find them? And the other side, how my services can change is a service changes. Do I even need to know that it did change? Or can I just continue using it, and if the change is not interesting for me, I can just ignore it. And I think there we really have a very, very nice body of experience and patterns in web architecture, right, that tells us how do you do that. And I mean, the biggest success story there is the web browser, right? When you look at the fact that I can use today's web browser to look at web pages that are 20 years old, and I can almost use, not quite I guess, but almost use a 20 years old web browser to look at a modern web page, right? If that web page is well designed, I can still kind of read the web page, right? And I think that's actually pretty amazing that you have this, even though the space is evolving so fast, that the decoupling is so good that you can actually get to that point. And I think those lessons would be very valuable for the microservices space as well. And I have to go a little faster here because we're a little bit behind schedule. But if you want to find out more, I definitely encourage you to just look into what are the design patterns for evolution, for designing for change, right? And it's very easy sometimes to just figure out, well, what do I need to do? I need to have well-defined extension points so that if people extend their services, those extensions do not trip up anybody who's consuming the service. And I need to have a processing model that says, if there's a new extension point, if the new extension shows up and you don't understand it, here is what you have to do, right? You have to stop and yell, or you can safely ignore it, right? Both are options that you can pick, but it's important that you pick and document it, right? And say, this is the proper way to use my service. If you see something you don't understand, stop, right? Or if you see something you don't understand, ignore it, it's fine, right? And in order to handle those, I think, interesting properties of microservices landscapes, right? I think to see how do I manage if I get to the point of hundreds or thousands of microservices, right? Is that something I can still deal with? How do I manage a landscape where my services are very diverse? Because developers have the freedom to make all kinds of design choices. And I still want to be able to use my services even though these might be different designs, right? And the third one would be, how can I actually deal with the fact that those services change maybe relatively frequently, right? And then how do I manage that in terms of creating certain guidelines, best practices that tell people, you have the freedom to update your service every 10 minutes if that makes you happy, but please don't break your API every 10 minutes, right? And here's a good idea how you may be able to do that, right? And I've written a little bit more here. I don't want to go through that in detail, like I said, with a bit of short of time. But mostly what I want to leave you with is really that, in my mind, the web as a decentralized system that is not just for web pages, but also is used a lot for services, right, can teach us a lot. And I think microservices now are really moving from the more traditional sort of system building that the SOAP services gave us to more of an ecosystem idea of people can do different things in different places and they have a lot of autonomy, right? And because that is something where I think the microservices really take us in that direction, I think looking at the lessons that web architecture teaches us is something that's really interesting and is something where we can also maybe take away some lessons that allow us to understand that, if I'm going to do this for another 5 years, maybe I should start thinking about those things, because at some point, otherwise, I might have a management problem. I might have sort of just too many of those things, right? Like, how can I actually make those available in a way that my evolving landscape remains useful for the developers that work in that landscape? Okay, and that's all I have. I'd like to thank you for your attention. These are my webpage, my Twitter handle, and my blog. If you want to find the slides are online. They're also, I tweeted the link on my Twitter feed. And with that, I'm done.